Mycelium can survive on almost anything, but it does really well with fibers because it needs both water and air. Fibrous material like cardboard or paper or a rotting log is perfect for mycelium because it can hold roughly equal parts water and air. So what people have done by, printing paper and cardboard is they have paused the natural cycle. If those trees weren't cut down and they were in a healthy ecosystem, then they would have fallen on the ground and fallen apart. That wood would have myceliated as it got soggy. And that mycelium, which is this thick white snow-looking stuff, would have sprouted mushrooms and been generally symbiotic to new trees. And it supports the forest life, so it essentially turns that dead tree into baby trees, into new trees and other plants. So we put that process on hold. My plan is to restart it. And all mycelium needs to thrive and become the snowy, spongy. It looks very much like snow and dirt, like dirty, snowy ice you might see on the side of the road. That's mycelium, the body of the fungus. All it needs really to thrive is air and water. Besides the waste, the cardboard, the plastic broken down into monomers, or the rice, or whatever it's growing on, consuming to bulk up and put on mass. And it can eat most things, depending on the variety and how it's presented. All mycelium needs really to thrive is air and water. The fibrous structures that we're designing already supply both air and water to every part of the mycelium, not too much, not too little, but we need a source of water. So, fountains. We focus on manufacturing fountains to go along with these structures. Our living architecture will be fine if you throw the capillary cable. And when I say capillary, I mean like when you leave the corner of a newspaper in your coffee and the entire newspaper ends up wet. Well, that's capillary action. And that's what I mean by capillary material. So all it needs to stay moist like that is a wet capillary line. Normally, each structure you build would be connected to a fountain, but you can keep your home alive by throwing that line down a gutter with runoff or wastewater, or simply burying a capillary line beneath the water table. And we'll have different kinds of capillary materials for different purposes. Burying it below the water table, using a well or fanning out in the air to catch fog, maybe even flying a kite that harvests clouds somehow. Wouldn't that be wild? Or you can refill tanks by hand, but having a capillary constantly being replenished by your fountain saves you a lot of work. This cable, imagine a big, like at least a foot across in diameter, a thick cable. And it sort of flattens out over walkways a little bit. It becomes wider, but eventually it makes its way to a water source where it performs this capillary action. And so these other water sources can supply a community as well as our fountains. The fountains just make it a lot easier and a lot cleaner, so it's safer. So mycelium is very similar to snow. I keep saying that. It looks like snow, but it also behaves like snow. We've all heard of the brilliant Inuit spiral ice dome structure. The igloo, here's how they make it. They climb up onto a snowbank, a really big one that's packed down. Old snow that is very slowly becoming ice. And so they climb up on there with a big saw. And they cut out a block, and these blocks are giant. Yard tall, meter wide blocks, and they're not all the same size, but they're big. And so to really replicate that with mycelium, I need an air channel because a mycelium colony that large would suffocate in the middle. Mycelium can only really breathe effectively a few inches deep, depending on species and substrate. So we would need to pipe the air within the blocks to make them that size. But I keep drawing that parallel, and I keep talking about igloos. Why? Well, here's the really interesting part. When you stack these blocks of ice and snow, this amazing trick of physics happens, where the blocks, where they meet, where one sits on top of the other, the weight of that block pressing down melts some of the snow, and that water filters into the snow above and below the stacking point, and then it refreezes. And what that means is that as you build the igloo, as you stack these blocks of snow, they form into a single piece of ice. That's exactly what our mycelium blocks will do. Well, not exactly, no, but functionally it's the same. If they're all moist, if they're all thriving, they're all alive, then they should be nice and fluffy and white in the connecting points. And if they are, they will grow together almost immediately. And then will very quickly end up completely covered in this white fuzz. At all the connection points, so that you can't see where one block ends and the other begins. So we can make igloos out of cardboard, and they will smell like the good earth. Here's the plan in greater detail. We're going to use time lapses designing this as parts are created by the 3D printers, as cardboard and fabrics myceliate within molds. After assembly, time lapses of structures growing, leaves and branches, myceliating, becoming white, changing shape. We'll start with just miniature versions at first, but we will run tons of trials. The footage will be very impressive. People will wonder if it's AI when they see these structures growing and expanding, growing together, and like reverse origami, becoming something you didn't expect, and then sprouting trees. It's like a seed for a structure, a useful structure. And we will show up in cities that need this. Cities with food deserts, and most cities have them, need this. A food desert is just a place where you can't get fresh food easily. After I told my uncle all about this, he was like, I have one word for you. Franchising. I was like, yeah, pretty much. That we're going to show up in like 30 cities with these recycling centers that accept every kind of waste stream. And we're going to turn all that waste into fountains with big tanks producing a life support structure that is made out of garbage, basically made out of waste, mostly mushroom cardboard and paper and, some plastic, but really mostly air. The structure ends up being like equal parts air, mycelium, cardboard, plant, and inert material. Maybe metal, as long as it has access to fresh water. Mycelium is functionally immortal. If it gets water and air and food, it can live forever. How old is the super colony in Oregon? We don't know. It's old. So all this cardboard and paper and plastic and every other kind of waste material is streaming into our locations instead of landfills where it would suffocate and ferment or just not break down. Instead, they come to us and we turn them into fountains and building materials. All sizes will probably work on robotic parts, legs, carapace, thorax, sort of giant myco-arboreal insects and whatever else we can imagine. We will make useful things. We will make useful things that support life. We'll make them for basically nothing. And we'll give them away for next to nothing. Maybe we'll mark up some sort of premium items, right? But then we will also distribute just massive amounts of perfectly good, not premium item for free. And I imagine these communities, these homeless communities, right now they're under bridges and in alleyways, parking lots and disused lots and abandoned buildings, all of these places where they congregate. We know they have access to fresh water because, they're supporting all these primates, right? They can definitely get water, even if they're not drowning in it. And frequently there is a gutter nearby or a pretty high water table which can support the mycelium, but fountains solve the entire problem. If there is at least one large fountain, wherever you have a group of tents and lean-tos and shacks, homeless people, maybe in the bivy sacks or whatever they do, surviving the elements. If you've plunked down a big fountain, and my definition of the word fountain is pretty loose, it's a big water vessel supplied by a well or a runoff or a faucet or whatever you can supply it with, and the water is moving, it's agitated. A vat fills, and water that comes splashing down, and that movement keeps it from growing anything or supporting any mosquitoes, and this big tank of fresh water is your lifeline. If the fountain is running, if it's flowing, there's enough water to support the community, which is made of these moist structures with mycelial parts that have a sort of airy interior, like capillaries of air, or the way the pieces fit together. They have sections missing, sort of like a Swiss cheese puzzle. So that when you assemble it, when you put it together, there are cavities and channels for air and for branches to grow through. And the way these things are built, they expand. They grow in structural stability, which means the walls grow in thickness. Arches grow into the ceiling, which grows into the walls, which grow into the ground, or a large pad or something that all of this sits on if you're in the city. The point is, these structures are made of living things, and each structural element is ready to expand. It's tightly wound or twisted or folded, and as they grow, they're designed to unroll, to unfold, to unfurl, or to grow further and further apart from each other because they're being lifted by different branches, which are being lifted by different plants or whatever. And then there's some sort of material between them, like an accordion that fills that space to form a window, or an unfurling myceliated section to form a wall. Whatever it may be, this is a structure that is alive, and it's growing, and it's easy to assemble, and it changes over time. So the way I'm designing is a bit like Legos, and I imagine people assembling it like Legos thinking, I like the shape of it, possibly not realizing that it's going to grow or how much. And their whole community maybe does this. And they, without realizing it, assemble the foundations of a garden castle. And eventually all their walls grow together. And these myceliated cardboard parts that support things like potatoes and sprout mushrooms, we design different structures with cavities within the mycelium that have everything a potato needs, so that to it is effectively underground. We can prefabricate them in designs especially made for potatoes, especially made for carrots. And where initially they were building little walls around their tents out of living building blocks, eventually they either added onto it or the structure itself became so overgrown and the parts expanded so much more than they realized or had planned for, that the walls came together. And now it looks like something like maybe a castle made of plants and trees with just one story. The igloos and arches have become the main structure, and the bamboo teepees have become turrets and spires, towers. These things could turn into anything, really. This is going to be a fun meet. I think people are going to get into it. And people will enjoy their tree houses, their igloos, their teepees. My goal here is for affluent normies, like regular people who have an apartment or a traditional home. Regular people. I would like regular people to walk by the shanty town, the local tent village, Skid Row, places like these, and I want them to be jealous because it's so lush and full of food, and these people that, these junkies that are begging on the sides of the streets right now for fentanyl money, now they're going to be trying to sell you carrots, which is like, that's good, that's a good idea, yes, please, I like this plan. And of course, a lot of thought has to go into this, just making sure nothing goes wrong. I have plans for rainy areas and plans for arid surviving mycelial structures. Mycelium dries up fast and needs access to a water source even more out in the desert. But mushrooms are kind of amazing. If you can stop the mycelium from losing water somehow so that the water condenses on something waterproof that is draped over it or wrapped around it, then the air circulates, the air comes in, oxygen goes in, carbon dioxide flows out of air channels so it doesn't suffocate, but the water cannot leak. The water is in a continuous vital dot, reusing the same water over and over and over again. It drinks it, and then it evaporates, and it ends up in the sheet, in the plastic sheet or cellulose or whatever you beeswax, whatever you made it out of, and then the mycelium drinks it again. If you grow mycelium, you know that when it begins to dry out, if you've put it in an airtight container or cover in plastic wrap and completely cover the space that it's in, you notice, because this condensation appears all over this plastic wrap, it's moist in there. And I've been asked about how this would work in an apartment. The medicinal and food-producing logs will work in an apartment if you have space for them, but let's be real. My target audience is mostly not people with homes.
So, those are some of my ideas. Read in the voice of Richard Feynman.